This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Russ Roberts about his newest book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. Russ Roberts is the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He hosts the award-winning weekly podcast, Econ Talk, and is the author of 3 economics novels, including The Price of Everything. Most famously, he is the co-creator of the Keynes-Hayek rap videos, viewed over 7 million times on YouTube, and his Twitter handle is @EconTalker. Russ, glad to have you on the program.
Great to be with you, Richard.
So, Russ, why is Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments the last self-help book we need to read?
Well, I don't know if it's the last one, and I'm not a big fan of self-help books, but I am a big fan of Adam Smith's forgotten or neglected book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it has a strong self-help flavor to it. I don't think Smith thought of it as a self-help book. I don't know if they had self-help books in 1759. I guess they probably had a couple. But what he does in there is he lays out a theory of human behavior, how we interact with each other, how we emotionally interact with each other, and drawing on that along the way, he gives a lot of advice on how to live the good life and what's a meaningful life. And as a result, there's a lot in that book that applies to our lives today.
On this question of the theory of moral sentiments, a couple of questions that come to mind, but I'll put those aside for now. What fundamentally motivates human beings, according to Adam Smith? What are we primarily about?
Well, Smith says, my favorite line, and probably in the book, is man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And he comes back to that theme more than once, a few times. And he sees, by loved, he means respected, honored, admired, paid attention to by the people around us. And by lovely, he means earning that respect, honor, praise, honestly, through our character and through our actions, our deeds. And what Smith's saying there is that what gives us fundamental happiness, what gives us true serenity, tranquility, deep sense of satisfaction, is the people around us and what they think of us, earning their respect through our behavior and our actions and the way we treat them and the way we treat other people generally and what we do with our lives. And so it is a different approach than the modern economics approach, which tends to see is a maximizing approach. If you had to squeeze Smith's into the maximizing framework, you'd say Smith says we try to maximize our respect that we get from other people. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. In talking with Vernon Smith and reading his work, Vernon's my second favorite Smith, and talking to Vernon, he's gotten me to appreciate that what Smith really has a whole different way of thinking about behavior than the modern maximizing utility or satisfaction. And the way Vernon sees it, and I think this is right, is what Adam Smith is saying is that when we interact with other people, we have certain rules of conduct that we try to conform to, certain rules of civility, of politeness, of empathy, of sympathy. And when we're interacting with people emotionally, when they have success or failure or tragedy or joy, we interact with them in certain ways that are prescribed by our culture and that we learn by interacting with other people and watching how they, in turn, interact with us.
So why do we get it wrong all of the time? You have a fabulous discussion of Smith on self-deception. And so how does that balance out with learning and understanding and acting harmoniously within a particular culture, a particular context? We seem to know fairly well what people want of us, and yet we frequently violate those rules and do injury to ourselves, do injury to others. Smith says there's this other part of us, right? We want to be loved, but we don't necessarily want to be lovely because of self-deception.
Well, we want to be lovely, but we want to think of ourselves as lovely even when we're not.
We get it wrong.
Yeah. So we're easily fooled because we want to see ourselves in the most positive light. And Smith talks at some length about how challenging it is for us to see our own actions honestly. Smith has a wonderful way of thinking about conscience and our self-awareness, and he uses this metaphor of the impartial spectator. He says that we imagine someone watching us who is not ourselves, who's not doesn't have a stake in the decision or the action we're thinking of taking, and we judge our own behavior based on what that impartial spectator would think of us. But he realizes, of course, that sometimes in the heat of the moment, passion, greed, appetite, we may not listen to that impartial spectator or convince ourselves that the right thing to do, the thing that serves us is actually the right thing to do, when in fact it probably, in some situations, it isn't. So he then says that when we are more contemplative after the passions have died down, we can look back and sometimes feel guilt or shame or regret. And we learn those lessons, and ideally that helps us be better when we come to those decisions in the future. But he's a realist. He's not a romantic. He sees us as we are, and he understands that we are frequently misled by ourselves, or we just do the wrong thing. And yet, either way I look at it is, and I think this is the way Smith looked at it, it's remarkable how well this self-regulating system of conscience works to create civilization. It's something we don't appreciate. We look around us and we see people interacting with grace and with harmony, and we don't think about how extraordinary that is, that we have created. It has emerged. It's through no one's intention. What has emerged is a set of social memes and norms and rules that by following them we are able to work with other people, we're able to live with other people, we're able to love other people, and it's remarkable that it works as well as it does.
On this idea of the impartial spectator, though, where does he get the notion of the impartial spectator? I mean, is this some sort of thin version of Protestant conscience, or is it more of is he recalling Stoic philosophy and that there is a harmony and rhythm within the natural world that man's a part of, and we're kind of called to discern and understand that, or is it something else?
Well, I can't say exactly where he gets it from, other than to say that it is novel. It is his contribution to theories of morality in terms of where we get our morality. And what he says there, which is rather extraordinary, what he says in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, is that the author of nature, meaning God, put inside us this desire to seek approval and to avoid disapproval. And that's what gives this the logic of the impartial spectator its power. So what I find fascinating is he doesn't say you get your conscience from God. He doesn't say you get it from your parents or your upbringing. He says you get it from the people around you by watching them growing up, seeing what earns respect, seeing what earns disrespect, and acting accordingly. And it's a very powerful way of thinking about one's own behavior. In the book, I suggest that it's a way you can improve yourself. Whether it's how we literally or actually decide what to do or not isn't so important. I think what's important is using that idea as a way to be self-aware, to step out of ourselves and think, judging ourselves and seeing how we can do better in the future. Again, it's not something we want to do. I don't know if you've ever been taped or videotaped or audio taped. Sometimes it's very painful to go back and watch or listen to yourself in action, and most people just don't. Most people just don't want to do it because they see the flaws. And but if you want to get better, you got to listen, you got to watch, and I think Smith is giving us a way we can do that.
On the impartial spectator, I just wanted to read from page 25 and just maybe add to our discussion. You say the impartial spectator sounds a lot like our conscience, but he provides an unusual source for that conscience. Smith doesn't invoke our values or our religion or any principles that might inform our conscience to produce feelings of guilt or shame at our misbehavior. And then you quote directly from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. It is he who, whenever we are about to act so as to affect the happiness of others, calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, though we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. Conscience literally means to know with others. And so when we think of conscience, we do tend to think of it in a very individualistic way, in a way almost of the individual and our imperial will sort of legislating what will be right, irrespective of largely of anything else, and or even of what the times may say. A couple of questions that come out of this for me on the Impartial Spectator, and particularly this idea of to know with others, and you do a great job of developing that. Now, what would someone like Ayn Rand think about this Impartial Spectator in that light? And then another question maybe we can talk about, is it too culturally dependent?
Well, yeah, starting with Ayn Rand, I think Ayn Rand is a little more self-centered than Adam Smith. I'm not sure what else to say about it. Smith sees us very much as social creatures, and I think he's right. I think we get a lot of our satisfaction from interacting with others, from sharing things with other people, from creating things with other people, whether those are in the world of business or whether those are in the world of nonprofits and charities. So we spend a lot of time with other people, and we spend, of course, a lot of time alone. And Smith really was focused on those interactions with other people. I see Ayn Rand as asserting more the primacy of the individual. And I think that's a shortcoming of her work. I think it limits the appeal and effectiveness of her economic vision, because most people want to share. They want to be charitable. They want to help other people. And, she wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And I think Adam Smith doesn't see selfishness as a virtue. He sees self-interest as being our inherent nature. And what he's interested in is, how do we rise above that self-interest? Why is it that people ever do anything charitable, ever do anything self-sacrificing to make the world better for other people besides putting themselves first? And what that passage you just read emphasizes is how Smith saw our ego relative to the rest of the world. It's that, well, we do kind of see ourselves as the center of the universe, but we realize that if we act like we're at the center of the universe, we won't have very many friends. And so he understood that we know that, and he talks a lot about why, how that affects our behavior. Now, when you talk about it being culturally determined, there is an issue. Smith grew up in the 18th century in 18th century Scotland, and he lived around a lot of people of I think very good character. His best friend was David Hume, who was an extraordinary human being. He lived in a time and an era of some intellectual giants who were around him, and he didn't travel much. He got to Europe for a period of time when he was tutoring the son of the Duke of Buccleuch, and that was a time he got to see the European intellectual world. But his knowledge of the rest of the world was an armchair knowledge, which it inevitably has to be for most of us. My point being that obviously culture, what is honorable and what is honored, depends on who you hang around with. And Smith does not talk about that. He does not talk about, at least in my memory, that it might be a good idea to hang around good people so that you get good influence and avoid some bad people because they're going to honor and disrespect a different set of behaviors. So there's no doubt it is cultural, and some cultures, I think, are better at creating trust and decency than others.
Yeah, no, I mean, I ask you that question because I remember, first being hired by Liberty Fund and going to a conference and reading Theory of Moral Sentiments, and that was kind of one of the first reactions I had to that is, what does this mean in this situation or in this situation? Does he provide us some sort of principle to lift us out of a cultural context? Because it may be the case, even within our country, that we need to be lifted out of what a lot of people are doing to be able to see cultural self-deception of a lot of different people acting in certain ways, but not acting in ways that are, incorporating minorities, incorporating other individuals that are being oppressed, and this sort of thing. But this only comes through an act of reflection, seems to me, on some sort of natural standard of reason, or God or revelation or something like that. That's where we start to have those sorts of reflections. And I think this is in the title. I wanted to ask you the question. He uses the term moral sentiments, not virtues. Is that significant for you?
Well, he's not. He talks about virtue a great deal in the book, but what he's really interested in is why we think certain things are moral and how well those impulses work and don't work. How we the limits, for example, of our empathy. And Smith saw compassion and altruism as he called it the feeble spark of beneficence. He did not think that our own inherent goodness drove a lot of good behavior. Instead, he saw that good behavior came from people wanting to earn the respect of those around them. And so, that's the way he saw the world.
On the point of we were talking about self-deception, and I think this ties in here, and sort of what sort of breaks does Adam Smith point to as ways to manage that? And and I was thinking, I think you and I are probably similar, and we are constantly called to self-promotion or to engage in self-promotion. Mm-hmm. And how does that spill over into wanting to see your name constantly, to see others mention your name? And Adam Smith deals with that. You write about that sort of tendency, the self-deception and the self-love being overly exercised. And I was thinking just along those lines of, how does one deal with that, in particular in a highly commercialized society where, and particularly as you move into a knowledge economy, it is very much about the individual working for himself. How does Adam Smith, how would he deal with those tensions?
Well, Smith said there are two paths to being loved. If you want people to pay attention to you, if you want people to think you're important, you can be rich, famous, and powerful. That's the one way. And, we see this all the time. We see people who are not particularly honorable or not particularly virtuous, but they're very wealthy, or they're very powerful, or they're very famous, or a combination of all three. And those folks command attention. People pay attention to them, they listen to them, they watch them when they enter a room. And Smith talks about how seductive that is to be one of those people. We have an inevitable urge to be loved in that way. And Smith says, avoid that. He says he even speaks against ambition. He says if you're ambitious, if you're not careful, you're going to get yourself on a treadmill that it's impossible to step off it once you've been on there. He doesn't use a treadmill metaphor, but it's the same point. And that's, Smith says, we all understand that, and that's what most people choose as their way to make themselves feel good about themselves. And he says the better way is to be virtuous. The better way is to. He has a minimum standard and what I call the gold standard. The minimum standard of earning respect, the better way is to be proper, to act with what Smith calls propriety. And that means conforming to the expectations of those around us in terms of politeness, in terms of prudence, in terms of being a nice guy, you might describe it. But to be a virtuous person is a lot harder. Virtue is a much higher standard. And he talks about different virtues. But the point is that it's very easy to forget about those virtues and to be seduced by the attention you get when you toot your own horn or promote yourself. And so, as you say, if you've got a podcast in a busy world, you've got to create some attention for it, and there's a temptation to do things that maybe aren't so honest, that are overly egotistical, as you say, as you point out. And Smith derides and criticizes that urge. He talks about self-promotion explicitly, and he talks, again, this is the 18th century, but things don't change much. He said you should avoid the quackish arts, the sort of pitiful ways that people try to get attention for themselves. And in our world, there's there's a fine line between self-promotion and being a jerk and exaggerating your accomplishments and trying to get people to pay attention to you. And so, my personal view of this is you have to have a little bit of dignity, or you're not gonna you're gonna look back on your life and wonder why you were such a crude self-promoter. What I say in the book is that sometimes sometimes it's a good idea to pass up an opportunity. It's not easy, but some opportunities are best left behind, either because they're not so ethical or they involve doing some stunts that might make you cringe when you look back on them later.
Yeah, I kind of approach that question through the there's the opening of your book, and you talk about the example of we injure our finger. Your example is we find out we have cancer in our finger, but the good news is it hasn't spread or anything like that. We can lance it or fix the problem. It will involve the amputation of our finger, and we agonize over this, and anyone would. And yet, but that we also learn about an earthquake killing millions of people halfway around the world, and we express concern, but we quickly get back to business and leave it behind, which would seem to suggest we are beings full of self-love, and this is just a problem that we have to deal with. And as you put that forward in the first part of the book, to me it set the stage for engaging Adam Smith and what he's dealing with.
That's his example.
Yeah.
I gave a modern version, and I take the reader back to his original version.
Yeah.
And what's amazing to me is that even though we have cable television and 24/7 where we can watch with horror what's going on in any corner of the world almost, it doesn't change the fact that, as Smith said, we sleep well after the deaths of people far away from us. And he does that. He brings that up because he wants to point out that, so even though we're more concerned about our little finger than we are about the deaths of people across the world, we don't act that way. We don't act as if our little finger is more important than other people. If we were given the choice, he says, if we could save our little finger by killing millions of people, we wouldn't think about it for a second. No one is that monstrous. And then that creates a puzzle. Why is it that if we care more about our little finger, which is, I think, the reality, in the sense that we will sleep badly the night before an operation that's going to take off our finger, but we are going to sleep well after thousands and thousands of people and their families have been killed in an earthquake, say in China, why are we so decent? And Smith's answer again is that although we see ourselves as very important, if we act that way, we don't have a lot of friends.
On this question, and I think we're kind of talking about the self-love and the self-interest, but also being other regarding. How do we reconcile, or do we even need to reconcile? Is this just a false problem scholars have created between the Smith we see in the theory of moral sentiments and what he's laying out about human flourishing, and the Smith of the Wealth of Nations, who talks so much about self-interest? And when he tends to describe the central actors in a free economy, I say central actors, businessmen, most of his descriptions are of a fairly negative character, and which seems to always is so interesting to me. And in particular, the way we talk about entrepreneurs almost as if they're heroes. And just thinking about Smith in this opening discussion of a free commercial society and what he's doing with it and the problems he sees.
Yeah, I try to deal with that in the book. I think it's something of a false question. I think so let me set up the question that people often ask, and then I'll try to take it in a different direction. What people ask is, we got The Wealth of Nations, and that's a book about the power of self-interest. That's a book about how people striving to improve themselves end up creating a world where a lot of people are a lot better off than they otherwise would be. And competition constrains our self-interest and forces us to serve other people in the commercial world. And to be empathetic in the commercial world, we have to figure, if you want to be successful as an entrepreneur, you got to figure out what your customers want and provide it, or figure out something that they don't even know they want and then delight them with it. And so that's the Wealth of Nations. There's nothing, as far as I know, almost nothing in the Wealth of Nations about virtue, about helping others in a direct, emotional way. It's a book about exchange and trade. Then he writes this other book, 1759. He writes it, The Wealth of Nations, 1776. He writes The Theory of Moral Sentiments first in 1759, but he revises it throughout his life, with the largest revisions, I think, coming in 1789, right before he dies, in the last edition. So that book is ever with him, this book about emotion, this book about fellow feeling, this book about how other people think about us, this book about virtue. So how did he write these two books and not have the themes interweave at all? It seems. And my answer to that, and there's been different answers, my answer to that is that he's talking about different spheres of human action. So in the case of The Wealth of Nations, he's talking about exchange. And even in Smith's time, exchange wasn't barter between two farmers. Trade was starting to grow. And so a lot of exchange was between strangers. Certainly people that you didn't see every day necessarily, certainly people you didn't interact with every day. They were sometimes people you saw at a distance. And in that world, empathy and emotion and fellow feeling is relatively thin. Our ability to care about people beyond our immediate circle of friends and family is very limited, Smith said. So in The Wealth of Nations, he's talking about self-interest, because that's really what comes into play when I get on the web and I try to find the best deal on Amazon versus some other website, or when I go to sell my grain in the town and get the best price for it if I'm a farmer. So self-interest is a pretty good working assumption for what determines how we behave in that setting. But when we think about the smaller circles of our interactions, not the exchange and trade and commercial interactions, but when we think of our daily life with our friends and family, our emotional interactions with the people that we see face to face, well, it'd be foolish to argue, says Smith, I think, that self-interest is the main thing that's going on there. Of course, we're self-interested when we think about our family and the way we behave, even with, say, our spouse. Of course, sometimes we get frustrated that our spouse doesn't that my wife, say, doesn't do exactly what's best for me, and I might try to get my way. But what I say in the book is that if that's the way you think of your marriage all the time, if you see your marriage as a place where you're trying to maximize your net benefit, you're not going to have a very good marriage. You're not going to have a very good family if you see your children as only as a source of benefit for yourself. And I think most people don't act that way. Of course, there's a temptation to, or again, self-interest is very powerful. But what Smith was interested in exploring in the Theory of Moral Sentiments was how my friends and family and I manage to interact, given that we are self-interested, but that we also want to be loved. We want to be respected and honored and praised. And so the books are really about two different types of interactions, the commercial in the case of The Wealth of Nations, and the personal in the case, and the emotional and the social in the case of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, the puzzle that I think is more interesting is in the Wealth of Nations, he's talking about why countries get wealthy and the power of specialization, the division of labor, the competition, free trade. And to me, the puzzle is, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, there's numerous examples, not like one. Many, many times Smith says the pursuit of wealth is a mistake. It's bad for you. It's seductive and leads you astray. It doesn't make you happy. And to me, the question, and he says, at one point he says, rich people, their eyes are bigger than their stomach. It's almost literally the phrase he used, the idiom he uses. He said, but that's a good thing because that creates benefits for other people. They'll hire people to make their gardens beautiful and to farm their lands, and that creates prosperity for people other than just the rich, and that's great. And so how do you reconcile those two Smiths? The Smith who says money's a fool's game, ambition is a mistake, with the Smith who says, well, here's how nations get wealthy. And he doesn't say anything particularly negative. In fact, most of the Wealth of Nations is about the benefits of wealth. And then I think the next question is, how do we as moderns, people living in a time of extraordinary prosperity relative to what Smith could even begin to imagine, what should be our attitude toward money and wealth and ambition and success? And I think the way I reconcile those two things for Smith and bring it forward to the modern time is that I don't think Smith's not against money, not against wealth. I don't think he could imagine the levels of prosperity we have for the average person. He did not foresee that, but he certainly could see, if he were alive today, how beneficial it has been for the average person in terms of lifespan and the ability to enjoy many aspects of life beyond working in a steel mill in our time, or say a coal mine, or a textile mill in Smith's time. It's a very life's pretty good. And I think Smith understood that. But what he also understood is that if you see money as something to earn for its own sake, if you see the pursuit of money as a goal rather than a means to an end, a different, more meaningful end, I think he says you're going to make a mistake. So I don't see Smith as being, he's not an ascetic. He liked fine things. He liked theater. He liked poetry. He liked travel. He wasn't he didn't think a person should live like a primitive with nothing nice. What he says is, he says it more than once, is that there's not a lot more happiness to be gained by being wealthy than being poor. A poor person, he says, who has his health and who's out of debt and has a clean conscience, he says, doesn't get much better than that. And in some sense, he's right. Those are the things, I think, that lead to serenity and happiness. And Smith's warning us about the pursuit of money for its own sake. But I think he also would have understood that the world we live in today has many benefits. But I think he would also say that if you're not careful, you can be seduced by the attractiveness of money in ways that are corrosive to one's happiness and well-being.
So could we say then that for Adam Smith, markets can't be everything? There actually have to be certain cultural preconditions, intermediate associations, et cetera, I guess that would be our term, that have to be ring-fenced, that aren't subject to evolution, or that aren't subject to the evolution of the market or to prices in general, but just are there and allow markets to flourish, and we should only lightly toy with them. Instructive for me in this regard is that Edmund Burke greatly admired Adam Smith. But Edmund Burke would say, he would certainly did not condemn the free market, but there were a lot of other things apart from the market that also had to be defended, according to him.
Yeah, I don't see them as being antagonistic to each other. I don't think Smith had a lot of respect for commercial life, and he saw commercial life as a civilizing factor. But it's certainly true that cultural norms, and trust being one of the most obvious ones that I talk about in the book, that certain cultural norms enhance the free market and make it more effective in encouraging human flourishing and people being successful in how they buy and sell from each other. But I think, to me, it's really a question of perspective. So, when people say, there's certain things the market, we shouldn't leave to the market, that's often, I think, just an ideological code for a message or a philosophy that isn't really being accurately described by that phrase. Just to take one example.
Well, healthcare is the big example that you hear constantly.
Well, I would say healthcare. I'd say education.
Environment.
Yeah, people would say those shouldn't be left to the market, and it depends what you mean by the market. To me, the market means letting people choose what they want and voluntarily interact with each other, and that would include charities, say, to provide nonprofit schools that would help poor people. It doesn't mean everybody's out for themselves when we say we leave it to the market. To me, it means we're not going to use the government for a top-down solution. We're going to let bottom-up solutions emerge, and I think those are often great. So I think when we use the word leave it to the market, we often mean let's put it in the profit monetary nexus. And if that's what you mean, well, yeah, I think there are a lot of things that shouldn't be that way. Again, family life, maybe helping poor people with better schools. I'm not saying those should be profit-maximizing activities. Maybe they'd be charitable activities. Yeah. So, again, it really depends on what you mean by the market.
Well, I guess the question was prompted by, just thinking about, what's called the Adam Smith problem. Maybe that's not a fair term. Is thinking about books like Peter Berger's book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. and just the idea that there are these certain character norms that have to be evident, which I think Adam Smith is describing, and you've done a good job of talking about in your book, that have to be evident and on display for markets to flourish. But is there not also a sense in which those can be eroded, even within a capitalist society? And that actually riches might leave us less disciplined, or that restraint might be foregone. And what's on my mind, and maybe this is, I don't think this is an unfair comparison, but is to think about looking at our society now. Like record numbers of Americans on food stamps. We have near 50% of people on some sort of federal funded welfare entitlement. We have, seems to be, at the very least, I don't think it's a prudish thing to say, we have a society that does not necessarily recognize restraint. And it seems to me, in a way, we're caught in the middle of undermining these preconditions. And I just, as I was reading your book, all this is on my mind. I don't know if you think I'm exaggerating, but I'd love to get your thoughts kind of around those questions, because if Smith is right, then it really is, I suppose, a never-ending character struggle. But I guess the problem as well is, when I think about the impartial spectator, is it's also a cultural thing that we've got to think of. And the problem being, what if what you're dealing with needs a lot of correction from above, or from without, I should say.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that government policies can erode the interactions that we have and the virtues that we have. If you create a safety net for financial firms, you take away the incentive for one of Smith's virtues, one of his key virtues, which is prudence. And so if you subsidize recklessness, you get more of it. I think that's a terrible mistake that we've been doing in America over the last 25, 30 years. Just the financial crisis, just the worst example of it. The aftermath of it suggests we're going to have problems like that going on into the future. So there's definitely an interaction between public policy that sometimes tries to make things better, and the consequences of those policies for our personal character and our interactions with others. And those are all endogenous. So again, I gave an example from the corporate side. If you tell people that you always get a do-over, that if you make a mistake, we'll shield you from the consequences of that, which is a human urge, right?
Yeah.
If, God forbid, one of my children does something foolish and puts themselves in jeopardy, I'm probably going to bail them out. Maybe not every time. There may be a point where I'm going to say, no, you need to bear the consequences, but I'll certainly want to bail them out. That's the way because I care so much about my children. Yeah. I may realize that, that may have some long-run consequences that aren't so good, but that's the struggle, right? That'll be the tension. When we do that politically, the problem is that we get special interests that are trying to advance their own themselves at the expense of the rest of the body politic, and that you're setting up a dynamic that's extremely unhealthy. And I think it's easy to get pessimistic about the state of our character. Overall, you can make a case that the glass is half full still. We have an incredibly entrepreneurial culture. I think most of our economy still is what I and Milton Friedman would call a profit and loss system. That is, if you do something great, you get to keep a lot of it, and if you do something really stupid, you can lose all your money. Now, it's true that there are parts of it of our economy that are insulated from those kind of failures, which I think is a huge mistake. But overall, we still have some of those feedback loops that I think encourage virtuous behavior. And I think in our private interactions, I give the example in the book of self-esteem, the self-esteem movement. I don't think Smith would have been a big fan of that.
I thought of that as I was reading your book. Yeah,
I'm not the biggest fan of it, but that's become a cultural norm that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's good for people to think more highly of themselves than they should. But that's very un-Smithian, it seems to me. So these are, we live in a dynamic culture where these kind of norms do change over long periods of time, and sometimes very short periods of time.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to belabor the point. It's interesting, thinking about an ad that has stuck with me. It came out right about the time the markets crashed in 2008. And I remember there was this, tremendous outpouring of frustration over the prospect of bailing out the banks. And of course, remember, the original statute passed was to bail out the banks, and that was then used to bail out car companies. But I remember all about this time, this shaking up and kind of this, I say, a grassroots outpouring of anger at this. And yet, I'll never forget seeing an ad for MasterCard for travel in Europe, and the visual was a circle around every capital in Europe, and so this could be you. You could visit all of these capitals. And I remember thinking about that ad. Those who wrote that or produced that are working, and this is my opinion, are working within a context of consumers who spend without limits. And I always have kind of thought about that, and seeing other examples of that just within marketing of a sense of Americans think that there really are no hard choices or no hard consequences to their choices. And so I guess maybe that's why I overly belabor that. I want to ask, and just thinking about maybe problematizing the idea of the impartial spectator and knowing within a democratic society. And I guess this question kind of comes out of one question for me is, who is Adam Smith responding to in the theory of moral sentiments? And I don't, I guess my back of the envelope answer is Thomas Hobbes, who said we're motivated primarily by the fear of death. Ergo, we need a strong, powerful central government to, in effect, free us up to pursue our own self-interest. And I think Smith is obviously offering something different there. But there's also Tocqueville. And Tocqueville says within a democratic society, the danger is that we're overly concerned what our neighbors think, and we're overly harmonizing. And why is this a problem? Because he uses individualism in a negative way, and it's an individualism that's isolating. And the tendency within a democratic society is to sink in, to turn in, and maybe the only people you really interact with, family, close friends, maybe a few coworkers, and you lose touch overall with society. But what you are aware of is opinion. You're too concerned with opinion, and you're not enough concerned with actually being involved and being engaged in those things you can't affect. So I suppose there is a Smith response there that's good. But I suppose as I think about that, is not also this problem of how a Democrat or a person within a democratic society interacts with this text?
Well, I don't know. I'm a Hayekian. So Hayek was always eager to point out, and it's a very Smithian point, that knowledge is dispersed, and we know very limited amounts of about the world. And what's extraordinary about our economy is how well it coordinates the knowledge without a central authority that has that knowledge and can use it. So the system, competitive economic system we call capitalism, coordinates knowledge without a central coordinator, and it leverages knowledge, uses knowledge, exploits knowledge that's dispersed in the heads of individuals all across the globe, and pulls it together to create something remarkable that we take for granted, like a pencil, which requires an immense amount of knowledge about the manufacture of it and the different parts, and that's a simple product. And Leonard Read wrote about that very eloquently, and that's right out of Smith. So that's one point I would make, is that it's true I have a limited knowledge of things beyond me. Opinion, I don't know. I know something about. I don't think I should pay too much attention to it. I think you can go astray if you focus too much on what other people think of you, and you don't have authenticity. But I don't think Smith was talking about that level of trying to please other people constantly. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point. You also asked, who was Smith reacting to? In many ways, he's reacting to Mandeville, who argued that greed takes care of everything because we serve others through our greed. And although Smith certainly saw that as a piece of the economic story, he very much thought that was a way too narrow and inappropriate vision of humanity. And I think he was right. And he wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments, I think, in many ways to answer Mandeville and say, that's not really what the human enterprise is about. There's a piece of us that's self-interested, but we're restrained constantly by away from what Mandeville calls greed, and I think what Smith would call greed. We're restrained from employing that to excess by our desire to be loved and lovely, and that I think is what Smith is trying to answer. And he later in the book, I don't write about this in my book because I'm not an authority on it, and I don't find it so interesting. But Smith tries to differentiate his theories of morality relative to others who've come before him, the Stoics and Mandeville and others, Hutcheson, his teacher, and so in many ways he's taking the wisdom of the ages and saying, I think we've left out this piece, which is the impartial spectator piece, and this desire to be loved and lovely.
Yeah, no, it just real quickly. Tocqueville's point is that's actually why central government becomes so significant and so powerful within a democratic society is precisely because of our concern over our overly drawn concern to other people is in a way we become like sheep. And so I suppose Smith's answer is kind of, you talk about this at the end, is you want to tend your garden well, and you want to tend it with other people who are also good, and you want to be engaged and involved with them. And that would actually, I think, speak to Tocqueville's concern. But Tocqueville and Hayek, I think, are in harmony and sync with one another in many respects. But I guess again, as I was thinking through that that popped out to me that an over anxiousness is also present and a desire to please other people. In ending, you talk about in the book, how to be good, or how to live a good life, or how to change the world. And you talk about people sending you letters and asking you. So for Smith, if someone, according to Theory of Moral Sentiments, principles we could derive, someone wanting to change the world in a cosmic way, that's actually the wrong question to ask, I take it. And I thought maybe we could end with thinking through that, because that's maybe a nice way to reflect fully on what Smith's getting at.
Yeah, and Smith doesn't explicitly write about this. I take this out of Smith as from the different things he has to say that are related to it. One of the things Smith's most eloquent passage probably in the Theory of Moral Sentiments is when he argues against what he calls the man of system, a person, a visionary, a person who has a vision for how humanity should behave, imposes that vision. He says as if the people in the society are nothing but pieces on a chessboard, and he says if you neglect, it's not verbatim, but this is the idea, if you neglect the fact that the pieces have a motion all their own on the chessboard, and you try to push them in ways that they don't want to go, naturally you're going to have a very chaotic and unattractive society. So Smith's very much against a top-down visionary of, the most obvious example being a Stalin or Hitler, Mao, someone who has knows wants to create a new kind of human being and is going to force people to get there whether they want to go there or not. And so that to Smith, to me, is certainly the wrong way to change the world. But Smith gives us a roadmap for what I think is a better way to, or maybe a better way to change the world, which is small steps, small actions in our interactions with others, and by acting honorably and honoring those who act honorably and being critical of those who are dishonorable, we create the culture that surrounds us, the regular self-regulatory mechanisms that keep us in line fairly effectively. And Smith says we create those. We don't create them from the top down. There's no committee. It's emergent. There's an invisible hand at work that comes from our desire to be loved and lovely. And what that does is it creates a culture of, say, in the United States, mostly of trust. Incredible number. I give many examples in the book of the many examples of where we transact and interact with others and don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about being taken advantage of because we can trust people around us. That's a glorious thing to have in place. Where does it come from? Well, nobody created it individually. We all created ourselves. So each time we act honorably, each time we choose to honor our commitments, each time we choose not to exploit someone when we could, to act opportunistically, we're enhancing the culture around us and doing a small but not unimportant act to make the world a better place. And so I think that's That's very Smithian, and he of course understood that there are many unintended consequences of sometimes well-intentioned acts, and these small steps are pretty effective. And I think it's easy to forget how important it is in day-to-day life. We look for grand, dramatic things. We're going to end poverty in Africa, or we're going to do this, that, or the other. And often those, tragically, not just fail to achieve their goals, they achieve other goals. They end up enhancing the power of a dictator or something much more depressing than just failing to achieve our goal of ending poverty. And so, I think to me, Smith is warns us, his understanding of the world warns us about the dangers of overextending ourselves and trying to do things we don't have sufficient knowledge about, whereas the world around us in our immediate circles, where we understand the consequences fairly well and we can interact with each other when we act honorably, we're enhancing the culture that allows all of our actions to merge with others and create the harmony that is a modern society.
Russ, on those notes of humility, wisdom, and restraint, I think we can bring it to an end. The book is How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. We've been talking with the author, Russ Roberts. Russ, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.